Here's a sneak peek from today's episode.
We have our first 100 customers, but then how do you get to 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million, right? And what we really need to think of is the product market fit doesn't become enough, right? We also need to think about like product market channel fit, right? So like where does that growth channel actually come from?
Welcome to the Content Amplified podcast, brought to you by Masset. Our goal is to help you get more from your marketing content. Each episode is a 10 to 15 minute interview with industry experts that share amazing insights to help you squeeze as much juice from your content as you possibly can. Here's today's interview.
Welcome back to another episode of Content Amplified. Today I'm joined by NJ. NJ, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, NJ, I'm excited. This is a cool subject that I think a lot of people need to hear. I think it's a slight spin on what people have been told matters most in a business. And I'm really excited for people to hear this. But before we dive into that subject, let's get to know you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work background.
That's a deep question. So I'll try to keep it kind of like short overall. So yeah, I'm NJ. I am born in a tiny country in the middle of Europe or Eastern Europe, depending who you ask, called Slovenia. But then I lived all around the world, essentially, from US to Sweden. And now I call London my base for the last 10 years. I come from a background of gaming and fintech, worked with businesses like TransferWise or Wiser, they're known these days, Uber, and even gaming startup studios like FitXR, who deal with VR gaming overall. So that kind of like brings me a very unique experience from a growth and product perspective around different channels, different platforms, and even different mediums overall from a tech perspective.
Yeah, I love that. That's so cool. So NJ, today what we're going to talk about, everyone has probably heard this concept of product market fit. Everyone talks about everything about that. It's so necessary for a business to find product market fit. You don't think it's quite enough. You have kind of a different take on this. What do you think we should be focusing on instead, or how do we augment this experience to make it even better?
All right, loaded question. So let's kind of like unpack it overall. All right, so every kind of like entrepreneur when they start off, right? So every entrepreneurial book kind of like raves about like a product market fit, right? Get a part like the product and find kind of like the market where kind of like that product will kind of like grow. No matter if it's venture backed kind of like business or like self-funded or bootstrapped, like everybody kind of like looks for that, right? And then if you don't achieve that, kind of like let's pivot in something else. It's quite interesting as well because that is kind of like necessary to get something out the door, right? An MVP or like these days, like even an MVP, especially if we're talking consumer products, sometimes isn't even enough, right? But like that kind of like will always get you the first 10, 100 customers, right? So something where early adopters kind of like think, oh, this is a cool idea. But that's not really how you build a business overall. So like if you only have 100 customers, great. If you're a B2B SaaS kind of like enterprise solution, great. That will be enough, right? But especially on the consumer front, that is basically like 0.1% of like the start that you're actually there. Right? But then very quickly, what you figure out is that you need a consistent and also like to a degree scalable funnel, right? How do you acquire new customers, right? And let's take the hypothesis that you're retaining the customers in a good rate, right? So, but how do you kind of keep on growing, right? So your investors or like your board will always kind of like want to have like, how are you going to grow next quarter, right? So, and by how much as well, right? Especially pre-seed, seed, series A, those are always like doubles, if not triples year over year. So what do we really kind of like at that point need to think about, right? We have our first 100 customers, but then how do you get to 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million, right? And what we really need to think of is the product market fit doesn't become enough, right? We also need to think about like product market channel fit, right? So like where does that growth channel actually come from? What is that growth channel? Do we understand that growth channel overall? And this is kind of like scalable, right? There's a lot of things that you're doing from 0 to 1 that are not scalable, right? And you can look at, for example, back in the day, like example with Airbnb, right? And their whole of scraping of Craigslist, right? There's only ever so many AdWords on Craigslist that you actually can get there. Cool. That gets you initial like hump, right? But then what do you do there, right? And for Airbnb, that was obviously their kind of like viral referral program, very much so. And then also like how you actually create this, like on the supply side, this whole entrepreneurial base overall. You add that, and their niche was really kind of like also like photography, right? At the beginning, to kind of like to differentiate yourself of like really poor photos, stage photos, predominantly stage photos, of kind of like how like something feels very much more appealing than like overall. So we really kind of need to think of like, what is this kind of like channel fit that kind of like is scalable, right? The best example of this, right? And I gave an example of Airbnb, but the best example people will kind of like recognize, a lot of themselves will actually recognize, and like I'm proud that I actually like had like a contribution to this, was Uber's referral program, right? So Uber was a great, like, it still is like a great kind of like product, right? But most of the people actually, first time they discovered Uber was on a Friday or Saturday night, right? They went out with friends. You've always had an issue. Okay, how do we actually get home when it's like 11 midnight, 1 a.m., whatever the kind of like the time is, and whenever in the city you actually are, right? There was always one friend was kind of like, oh, I just have this new app, I'll just call it like a cab, right? And then like a black car rolls up, or like later on a person in a Toyota Corolla shows up, right? And that kind of like feels very magical, of like, hey, you summoned kind of like something, right? It's kind of like feels like something that was very reserved for like the upper rich class, that's now accessible kind of like to everybody, right? Very easily. And the easy part then, when you actually think about it, is like, I want that service as well, right? How do I get it? Well, cool, I'll give you a code, right? Because like I get something, you get something, right? And even if there was any barrier left at that point, right, was it gets bridged immediately with a referral code, because now you have an incentive, right? Now you have no risk to actually try out the product for yourself whenever you want to. And that kind of like really cements you as kind of like becoming a customer. So that Friday and Saturday night, then like week over week, is kind of like how you actually grow, right? The referral program for Uber was that kind of like scalable thing, to a point where they've probably like at some point started running out of like people to add to the top of the funnel, because let's face it, like it's very rare to find a person that hasn't really tried Uber like before to even have it a referral program. So
Yep.
that's the downside, right? So like a channel that was immensely successful at some point kind of like falls like next to zero, because there's nobody else to or like left to acquire overall.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I love that. So I love product market channel fit. So when you're looking at it though, what comes first? Like, are you trying to find product market fit and then you throw in channel? Are you doing this all at the same time? Is there any kind of a timeline when it comes to that whole process? How does that work?
It's a very interesting one, right? And I think like the question is tangentially tied as well to how do you ever like find like that channel fit, right? And like how do you even like get the product that has like that in mind, right? And like it really comes down to knowing who your customer is, right? And how they actually behave. So I think product market fit is probably always going to come first, right? You need to have some kind of like a product that is there, but very fast after, you're going to actually have to find this kind of like, what is the channel, right? If we go back to the example of Airbnb, like a lot of times we hear Airbnb found this kind of like niche between apartments and hotels overall, right? And there was this kind of like untapped market of potential. But like for those of us that have been like around like on this planet for quite many decades, I would actually say, there was something before Airbnb that actually had like really kind of like big following, right? And that was couchsurfing. And couchsurfing always kind of like existed. So when Airbnb launched, it was achingly similar to that point. So like the product market fit arguably was already there. Couchsurfing never really had was like really strong channel fit outside of like people that use hostels, like young people that wanted to travel for really cheaply, right? How do you kind of like break out of that group? And Airbnb kind of like nailed that from a perspective of, again, the referral program we already mentioned, but also like their really smart way of how they actually got the supply side like going, right? Which was with scraping Craigslist and kind of like getting all of those people that were like posting on Craigslist to instead post on Airbnb. So they had a really kind of like dynamic marketplace overall. But none of that really happens if the product isn't really there.
Yeah, I love that. So product's got to be there, the product market fit, and then the channel comes into that. How do you know? This is one of the hardest things for every marketer. We have to justify everything we do. How do you know if you've nailed product market channel fit? I think product market fit is almost impossible to measure anyways. It's so tough. How does product market channel fit even work? Is there like a solid way to actually measure that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, right? When we think about like how do you measure any channel, right? So it's becomes kind of like fairly easy, right? Especially if it's a digital channel, you will have some tracking in place or some kind of like attribution modeling in place to know, okay, this is my investment, this is what I got in return, whatever kind of like that objective is. Clicks, impressions, conversions of like your funnel. And then like what is the cost of that kind of like action to happen. I think it's similar when you look at like product market channel fit, right? It's your first kind of like few channels that you actually launch, right? See like how much time, effort, maybe even kind of like capital have I invested into this channel and what have I actually gotten in return? The beauty of like really pre-seed seed startups is that once you find something like that, you'll immediately kind of like see the curve. Let's like go straight up, right? Very fast because you're still dealing with very low numbers. So you immediately kind of like know, okay, there is something there for it to be explored overall. I think a great example we had this was I was consulting an esports startup called Fnatic a few years ago, and they've actually took a very bold move to manufacture their own gaming peripherals, right? So think mice, keyboards, headsets, because they believe they can actually generate from the sales to of those things to their base and even like outside of their fan base. They can generate more revenue than it can actually get from a sponsorship deal. And they really kind of like brought me in because that was a bit out of whack, right? So like sponsorship deal technically would have gotten them more. So how do you kind of like solve that? And they really had a product market fit. It was a great product, very optimized for gaming, mechanical keyboards, but kind of like nobody really knew about them, right? Outside their own fan base, because then it really kind of like bridged that. So what we kind of like did was figure out like, okay, what do people that are like into gaming keyboards, gaming mice, what do they actually really care about? And it really kind of comes down when you talk to a couple like 10 customers, it's two things. What do the best players in the world use? Is number one, right? And then two is what do content creators actually recommend as well, right? And we're not talking about like big content creators, right? With millions of followers, NKBHD, SuperSaf and the likes, but we're actually talking about like creators that have like 50K followers. Like they're a lot more trusted overall by people than like all the big ones. So we kind of like, once we established that, we were kind of like, all right, how do we get this product in the hands of these content creators? But then at the same time, for our own players, we need to publish like, what do our best League of Legends players actually use, right? What keyboard do they use? We manufacture 3 of them, right? So which one is it? Which mice is it, right? What settings do they actually use? Because fans want to mimic that, right? They want to do that. And that kind of like really fueled that kind of like whole sales funnel overall, because now you really found like a channel fit overall, right? Those were actually 2 channels, but like 2 channels that you could actually like develop and grow over time fairly easily, right? And none of them have like are your typical growth channels, right? So Google search, paid social, for example, right? They're very different, and you need to kind of like figure out how to actually manage them over time. But they're very kind of like specific to this kind of like example. So like that's another example how like you need to know your customers, talk to them, know where they actually like are dwelling online or offline, and like how do you actually engage with where they actually are overall.
I love that. That's so cool. And that was kind of a good answer into my next question. So I'll kind of ask it and maybe we can add a little bit of context into it. So I love it. You're obviously looking at your customers. Like you said, you're trying to find out where do they spend time online. That is driving your channel decision, right? It's telling you what experiments to run, what channels to go to, where to try to go, in that area. When do you feel like a test of a channel, it's time to move on to the next channel? Like, is there anything for you? I love the hockey stick moment. You found a channel because you've already found product market fit. You've got the channel that accelerates the growth. It just gets it into more people's hands. When do you feel like, let's do a different channel? What's some advice you could give there?
I think it's the best advice I can give there is actually start off with very clear objectives, right? And like set your kind of like time frames overall, right? So we're going to try this new channel for 2 months, we're going to invest X amount of money into it, right? If we can't make that work, right, we have a strong enough confidence, a strong enough signal that this channel is not for it, right? Because at that point, there's been a long enough time. You need to be careful with a long enough time, right? Where you could actually experiment with different things, right? If you're like 2 ad sets with a couple of ads, and 1 campaign on the channel, that's not really going to give you enough signal overall, right? But if you tried 10 ad sets, 100 ads, something somewhere should give you some signal that this will actually work, right? If you don't get that, then and this is kind of why you time box it, then it's kind of time to kind of explore other things, because again, potentially, like you said, this could potentially turn into a hockey stick moment, right? But as well, working in startups, we don't have infinite amount of time, right? So you could actually be working on that channel for 4 years, and then at some point, boom, it just takes off, right? You figure it out. But that's also 3 years essentially that you could be working on something else on a different channel, and you could actually find 2 different channels that actually work in the same time frame, right? But it is important, I would actually say, that at some point you kind of have a revision of these experiments of what failed, and just try to retest, right? Channels change, audiences change where they actually go over time. So it is important to kind of revisit and remind yourself, maybe we should actually kind of retry this again.
I love that. Okay, that's awesome. This has been an absolute masterclass when it comes to product market and product market channel fit. NJ, though, we have run out of time. These episodes go by so quick. If anyone wants to reach out and connect with you online, how and where can they find you?
They can find me both on LinkedIn, both on Twitter at how do you say NJ handle. Happy to connect. Any advice that anybody needs, please do reach out. I'm happy to kind of help a fellow growth marketer out.
I love it. Anyone listening or watching this episode, just simply go to the show notes. We will link to NJ's LinkedIn profile directly from those notes so you can find him. NJ, thank you. This has been amazing. Really do appreciate your time today.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Content Amplified podcast. Please subscribe and leave us a review. And for additional ways to get more out of your content, visit our website at getmasset.com. That's getmasset.com. And tune in next time to the Content Amplified podcast.